Starting us off today, if we want to talk about brutal and we want to talk about comic books, then there is no better place to look than the 90s. Comic books in the 90s just happened to have this gritty, grunge, extreme thing going on, and the last Avengers story was a pretty good example of this. With this really cool, chunky, gritty art style, it told a story set in the future with a new team of Avengers. Just kidding though, because they get completely wiped out within the first few pages. The current team of Avengers of this alternate future and their base are completely wiped out by an absolutely massive explosion caused by Ultron 59. Now Ultron basically then challenges Hank Pym and the OG Avengers to a final fight against himself, Kang, and the Grim Reaper. The thing is, there were not that many of the original Avengers left, with a lot of them being wiped out by villains or even by their own fellow Avengers. For example, Tigra was torn asunder by the Hulk, who had basically gone bananas, and then he and Wonder Man got into a massive fight that wiped them both off the face of the Earth. The Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver both lost their lives at the hands of the Vision, and the rest of the team just scattered. But while the 90s were characterized by the extreme, the early 2010s were characterized by zombies. It's just what happened. Probably because of The Walking Dead, to be perfectly honest. Marvel absolutely jumped on that with Marvel Universe vs The Avengers. Now this story, told from the perspective of Hawkeye, saw a plague turn people into intelligent zombies. The Avengers led any effort they could to try and contain the virus and save the populace. But when society collapses, it kinda seems to bring out the worst in people. The Avengers' efforts to save the world were consistently thwarted by infection, greed, and Doctor Doom, which I don't think anyone is too surprised about. It had a very grim ending, with most of the Avengers being wiped out entirely or going into hiding to survive any way they could, with Hawkeye's skull being smashed by an infected Thor. It's pretty rough. But moving on, during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, one of the greatest Avengers runs ever, these things called incursions started to happen, orchestrated by the Beyonders. Essentially, two universes would crash together, destroying them both, and the focal point for that crash was the Earth itself. When the incursions started to threaten the multiverse, Namor the Submariner basically found multiple different ways to go about wiping out any alternate Earths that appeared in order to save Earth 616 and save both universes. That's pretty brutal on its own, especially when he teamed up with Thanos and his Black Order, plus some powerful additions. But then on top of that, the Avengers essentially got split right down the middle. On one side, Iron Man and his group were trying to save their Earth, while Captain America's faction essentially wanted to stop the amount of destruction caused by Iron Man and his side. Meanwhile, you've got extremely powerful cosmic heroes being wiped out by the Beyonders left, right, and center, and it all came to a climax as pretty much all of reality got destroyed and a massive battle between colliding Earths and opposing Avengers took place. Now, it's never a good time when friends turn on friends. While there was a clear winner in terms of who won the conflict in Marvel Comics' Civil War event, that being Tony Stark, in the grand scheme of things, there really wasn't any winner at all. The Civil War split the entire superhuman community down the middle. Heroes allied with villains, friends turned on friends, people were manipulated into joining a side, and a few of those people even passed away, all for an act that would require the registration and regulation of superhuman individuals following a completely avoidable superhuman caused catastrophe. And while you had Tony Stark coming out on top, he made a lot of enemies along the way, including Spider-Man, and I don't think he ever intended for the death of Steve Rogers. Also, after he came out on top, he was put in charge of S.H.I.E.L.D. and did a spectacularly bad job, leading to Norman Osborn, of all people, to take over, ushering in a whole lot of bad. I don't think anyone really came out from Civil War feeling particularly great. But the Avengers don't just exist in comic book form. Sure, the movies are never as vicious as the comics can be, but there is at least one occasion where things went pretty bad for our cinematic heroes. In the MCU, most of the movies follow a pretty simple idea of a hero facing and eventually defeating a villain, coming out triumphant by the end of the film, completing an arc. Even if the villain survives to continue into other films in the cinematic universe, they are still usually defeated by the hero at the end of their debut movie. Well, when we were given the Avengers Infinity War, it marked the first time in the MCU when the heroes, and furthermore, all the heroes together, officially lost by the end of the movie. Despite their best divided efforts to stop Thanos from acquiring all the Infinity Stones to complete his mission, he still managed to put them all into his big golden gauntlet and snap out half of the life in the universe. It left the heroes in shock of what even just happened as they watched their friends turn to dust, and when we meet them all in the next film, Avengers Endgame, they've all been left reeling and trying to just move on from such a massive defeat, which, sure, I guess led to one of their greatest victories, but whatever.
I was not expecting this next one, which is quite a twist. Or rather, I wouldn't have been expecting it if I hadn't read it later. 2023 for me was a year of mainly focusing on indie comics in terms of my collection, seeing if I could make it like a whole year without really collecting mainly superhero comics from the big two myself, instead focusing on collecting books from smaller or still large but honestly alternative publishers. Dynamite, Image, IDW, and even still some like really indie like self-published stuff. For the most part, I succeeded in last year's New Year's resolution. Yay, in regards to this, but the downside was I ended up being more behind on my big two superhero stuff, like X-Men. As such, I already kind of knew the events of the Hellfire Gala before I actually read that Hellfire Gala. Even knowing it though, it was still shocking to behold Nimrod flying in and pretty much insta-killing, for the most part, the newly announced X-Men team. Honestly, poor Dazzler. I was so excited about Dazzler joining that team, and then when I heard that that happened, I was like, ugh. And then when I read it, I was like, ah! Contrary to the last point, this one was very unexpected. Obviously with Hellfire Gala, I kind of already knew what happened even though I hadn't read it yet. This one caught me unawares. It's because it was one of the first fights that we saw during the Ten of Swords Otherworld tournament, and I honestly had expectations going into this event that were instantly shattered here. Pardon my pun there. Sorry, Betsy. In this first fight of the tournament, Captain Britain's Betsy Braddock was forced to face off against Morocco's champion, Iska the Unbeaten. Iska gets her name from her mutant powers, which prevent her from ever losing. And while I expected that Betsy might be the first one to, pull off such a feat and make Iska lose, since she was the hero in this scenario and Iska, at the time, was the villain, it turns out I was wrong. And true to her name, Iska made short work of Betsy, literally shattering her into thousands of pieces. Yeah, I didn't see that one coming. I feel like wait, what just happened pretty much sums up Ten of Swords as an event. It's just bonkers. Bonkers I think in a good way, but that's my opinion. Another battle that I wasn't expecting to go how it did was the one with Uranus versus, well, pretty much all of Morocco to be honest. But more specifically for this point, I'm talking about the Eternals villain facing off against Magneto, who is of course usually a villain of the X-Men, but in X-Men Red is really more of a hero here. Magneto here seemingly holds his own at first, but in the end has his heart removed by Uranus and is left for dead. It's also a pretty quick fight. It's like brutally quick. It's a seemingly gruesome end for a long-standing character, but what's even more intense is it would shortly after, in the same issue, be revealed that Magneto was so committed to getting revenge here, so willful, that he refused to die, using his powers in place of his heart to move his blood through his body and will himself to keep going so he could live to get revenge on Uranus for what he had done to mutant kind and planet Morocco. Heartless Magneto is scary Magneto. This death of a character I'm about to touch upon though is an honest real one. Synch was long dead up until recently in the comics. Thankfully, he was one of the first that the mutant nation of Krakoa brought back, prioritizing his resurrection so that he might be acclimatized and prepared for his mission in the vault alongside Darwin and Laura Kinney's Wolverine. Before his mission there, however, which he miraculously survived, he gave his life to protect others when Emma Frost's school for young mutants was attacked. This was his previous death. Tragic. Generation X, let's go. What makes his death in Generation X even more brutal is the fact that Synch gave his life to basically save other human kids who also attended the school, even though many of the human kids there were pretty unkind to the mutant student body they were forced to share the school with. Another heartbreaking defeat that I found to be extremely shocking and brutal was the loss of Captain Kate Pryde. And Lockheed, poor Lockheed, though fortunately Lockheed, his life was not lost. We must protect Lockheed at all costs. This all went down in the first volume of Marauders, a series that constantly pushed the envelope I felt for what we expect of these characters while also staying true to them. Kate was the leader of this new Marauders team, making her pretty much the main character of the series. So seeing her lost at sea at the hands of Sebastian Shaw was devastating, especially when you consider this happened only in issue 6 of this series. Yeah, just taking everything we thought we knew about what was going on and flipping the script. While a lot of the times we talk about the events of House of M and M-Day as being like the worst things mutants have ever lived through, there was a moment that was even more a brutal brutal loss for Marvel mutants in comparison, I'd wager. One that also cost millions of lives. Millions of lives. I think actually M-Day only cost million, and not even lives, just depowering individuals. But in this case, these people were wiped off the face of the earth. Cassandra Nova returned to get her revenge and ended up killing Donald Trask III in one of the most disturbing ways I've ever seen in a comic, while also merging with him, able to use his voice after his death to command the Master Mold and Sentinels. During the E is for Extinction story, Nova unleashed these Sentinels on Genosha, resulting in what we refer to today as the Genosian Massacre, which cost mutant kind an estimated 16 million lives. Yeah. Doing far more damage than M-Day and making M-Day even more devastating as a result when it did happen, since the mutants' numbers were already severely reduced going into the House of M event because of course, the Genosian Massacre. Like, if the Genosian Massacre hadn't have happened, we would have had more mutants even after M-Day because there'd just be more people in general. So even though many of them would have been depowered, we still would have had a lot left.
Speaking of which, let's start with Old Man Logan. The Hulk and Wolverine have had one of the oddest rivalries. It all started when the Wolverine was introduced in the Hulk comics, in the Incredible Hulk issue number 181, and they've had many rematches over the years, with some of the most notable appearing in What If, Volume 2, number 50, Ultimate Wolverine vs Hulk, World War Hulk, X-Men, Savage Wolverine number 5, and the Incredible Hulk number 340. But their nastiest bout was definitely in Old Man Logan. Following a huge conflict where the villains managed to band together and wipe out almost all the heroes, a pretty sinister Bruce Banner took over a section of California with his inbred kids, the Hulk Gang. In the last few issues of that story, in revenge for the Hulk wiping out his family, Wolverine went on the warpath and eradicated most of the gang. Banner hulked out into this 30-foot tall nasty Hulk and ate Wolverine alive, only for Wolverine to reform inside his stomach and cut his way out. This wasn't the end of the Hulk though, and Old Man Logan would face not only the Hulk again, but even his smarter, devious counterpart, the Maestro. Speaking of Maestro, that brings me to my next memorable moment. For any of you who might not know, Maestro is a version of the Hulk that came to us in the Future Imperfect storyline. Taking place in an alternate universe, thanks to a nuclear conflict that wiped out almost all the superheroes and most of humanity, the Hulk actually thrived. He began absorbing all this radiation from the conflict, making the strongest, smartest version of the Hulk that had been seen up until that point. Maestro Hulk took control of the remnants of New York, called Dystopia, and he ruled it with an iron fist. Future Imperfect essentially gave us our regular 616 Professor Hulk, traveling to this alternate future and facing the Maestro version of himself. Maestro completely pummeled the living snot out of Professor Hulk, eventually snapping his neck, and then villain monologuing at him the whole time. Professor Hulk only won when he brought Maestro back in time to when the Gamma Bomb first went off, and he let Maestro succumb to the blast. As you do. When fights between Wolverine and Maestro were pretty brutal, another character who often fights the Hulk would be Hyperion. These two absolute powerhouses have also faced off a bunch of times, but if we're looking for brutality here, I shall turn your attention to Heroes Reborn number 2 by Jason Aaron. This story found a new Hyperion, who had just wiped out Galactus by flying straight through his head, fought off against versions of Gladiator and the Imperial Guard, Mr. Beyonder, and a giant version of Ultron. But the last thing he needed to do was stop the Hulk. Hyperion finds him trying to tell a group of kids about how he's not crazy, how history has changed, and how he's sad, which makes it almost upsetting after the Hulk gets his hands on Hyperion's throat. Hyperion invokes an executive order and uses his laser eyes to blow holes into the Hulk, taking his life until he finally stops getting back up. Let's move on to Emil Blonsky, who has been an enemy of the Incredible Hulk for a long time. So it doesn't come as a surprise that he's also taken some of the most brutal beatings that the Hulk has dished out. Granted, I'm not gonna say he doesn't deserve them. In Incredible Hulk issue 54 from 2004, Emil makes the small mistake during a massive scuffle of reminding Bruce/Hulk how he ended Betty Ross's life with his irradiated blood and asking if the Hulk ever thinks about that. And to that I say, my guy, what the heck are you thinking? To the shock and surprise of nobody, this throws Hulk into a fit of rage, double-fisting Abomination into the sky and absolutely pummeling him, with one panel showing the Hulk punching Abomination so hard his fist looks like it completely implodes the villain's face, with chunks flying off. And then he throws Abomination into a helicopter. You know, just cuz. Just so we're aware, Abomination isn't a pushover. He regularly throws punches with the Hulk, even beating him a couple of times. But Hulk put him down in a few pages, and all it took was a mistake of a few choice words. Think before you speak, folks. The end series chronicles the last days of various different characters in the Marvel Universe. For a lot of Doomsday type stories, it often ends in the Earth being destroyed in a nuclear war. But What remains after that? Well, basically the Hulk. That's it. That's all. Just the end of the world and the Hulk. As the only human left on planet Earth, Bruce Banner wanders the aftermath in an eternal struggle with himself, as in an eternal struggle with the Hulk. Basically, Bruce has seen the deaths of everybody he loved, everybody he cared about. There's nothing left in this world for him, and he just wants to pass on. But no matter what he does, the Hulk's not gonna let him. Hulk not only stops Banner from ending his own life, but the Hulk doesn't succumb to anything. Not even giant mutated cockroaches that essentially swarmed and devoured as much of the Hulk as they could. Bruce and Hulk have a huge internal falling out, but then Bruce has a heart attack that actually ends his life, or at least half his life. Because while the Hulk himself goes on to survive, now he realizes just how alone he really is.
Now, following the Civil War event, which we just talked about before, Tony Stark became the head of S.H.I.E.L.D., and he got one of the worst calamities to deal with in the form of Secret Invasion, where it was revealed that the shape-shifting aliens known as the Skrulls had basically infiltrated the Earth, with many of the world's heroes actually being Skrulls in disguise. At the end of that event, Norman Osborn was the one to actually save the day, and he made Tony Stark look so bad that Norman was actually given control of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Avengers. But he made some big changes. Norman took the villains Daken, Venom, Moonstone, and Bullseye and repackaged them as Wolverine, Spider-Man, Ms. Marvel, and Hawkeye. Joining them up with heroes Aries, the Sentry, and Novar, Osborn himself donned Stark tech armor to become the Iron Patriot, and this team became known as the Dark Avengers to fans. Villains taking over as the world's premier superhero team went just about as well as you'd expect it to. Now, normally it's the Avengers who are going on the offensive in order to defeat the villains, but in Avengers Under Siege, it was the Avengers who took the beating. Determined to destroy the team who he believed had taken out his father, Baron Zemo II created a new version of the Masters of Evil, and under his leadership, this team of villains took down the Avengers with a quickness. They blitzed the heroes, taking their base of operations from them, and they put a few of the Avengers in the hospital, with Hercules, Captain America, and even their butler Jarvis being really badly injured. Not to mention the damage that they did to civilians along the way. The Masters of Evil took way too much pleasure in their job, and they were very effective. The Avengers were left without a home, beaten and demoralized. Now obviously things changed and the villains were eventually defeated, but we the fans hadn't seen the Avengers this badly beaten up until this point. The Avengers assemble. It's their thing. So naturally, when they're disassembled, it's not a good time. And it's mainly thanks to the Scarlet Witch. Wanda and the Wasp were just kind of chilling by the pool when Wasp decided to mention Wanda's kids. The only problem is that the existence of her children had actually been wiped from her mind, and when Wasp brought it up, it brought all those memories back, and Wanda absolutely lost it. Several things happened next, with none of the Avengers even knowing the cause. For starters, Scott Lang, Ant-Man, lost his life when a previously deceased Jack of Hearts showed up and just detonated. While the heroes were trying to figure out what even just happened, Vision showed up saying that he was not in control of himself and that he is sorry, as he also began to detonate, and then Jennifer Walters, She-Hulk, began to get uncharacteristically raged and tore Vision in half. Next, we saw Tony Stark at the UN conference randomly start to act as though he was incredibly drunk, even though he hadn't had a single drink, and he verbally accosted the Latvian ambassador and threatened him, and then a whole invasion by the Kree just randomly came out of nowhere, resulting in the passing of Hawkeye, and then the Kree just randomly left as quickly as they showed up. All of that was actually Wanda Maximoff using her reality warping magic. It almost led to the superhero community deciding to put Wanda into the afterlife, and it led directly to the House of M story. Now, while some brutal Avengers moments take place on a universal scale, some are much more personal, and the court-martial of Yellowjacket is exactly that. Hank Pym is a founding member of the Avengers, but his legacy took a very drastic turn, and surprisingly, it wasn't because he was the one who created Ultron. Hank had a bit of a mental breakdown, and he ended up going by the name of Yellowjacket, and that's fine. Call yourself whatever you want. But if you strike your wife, then no one is going to respect you, and that's exactly what happened. When Hank hit Janet Van Dyne, it basically became the defining moment for his character, and there was no way he could come back. But then he made it even worse. Pym essentially orchestrated a robot attack on the Avengers, and he figured that if he destroyed the robot, he could earn back the Avengers' respect. After Janet Van Dyne defeated the robot herself, Pym was kicked out of the team and his marriage ended pretty soon after that. But finally, in at number 1 today, with a title like Marvel Ruins, you can imagine it's not all sunshine and rainbows, and it really wasn't. This is a story taking place in an alternate comic book universe where literally everything that could go possibly wrong does go wrong. It's honestly best to just list off some of the events, then get specific here. The Fantastic Four's spacecraft crashed into the Earth and Ben Grimm was left with survivor's guilt, because he was the only one who survived. The Incredible Hulk is not so incredible in this universe, and the gamma radiation that he experienced left him as a hulking mass of tumors and deformity, and it's horrifying. Thanks to the radioactive spider, SpiderMan did not gain the abilities of a spider, but he instead developed an incredibly brutal mutant virus that left him with a terrible skin rash and had him captured and quarantined by the government. The Scarlet Witch in this universe betrayed the Avengers to the government, leading to the Quinjet being blown up with all of them inside. Nick Fury was introduced to the idea of eating other people by Captain America of all people, and Johnny Blaze just sets himself on fire as a stunt and does not survive. Even Magneto goes off the deep end here, with his powers going out of control in an airport, destroying literally everything. The whole story just leaves you wondering what you're supposed to do with your life now. It's very, very, very bad.
Number 10, Punisher vs. a Criminal. This is going to be an interesting one to try and describe. This devastating beatdown comes from Punisher Max, issue number 28. If you don't know Punisher Max and you like brutal moments and storytelling, this might be a series for you to check out. In issue number 28 of the series, before he gets to the head of a criminal operation that he's in the process of stopping, Frank deals with the son of the operation's head, Chris, attempting to get information from him on his father, Tiberiu, and their associate, Vera. He attempts to get him to talk by seemingly numbing him and then using his organs as basically decor for a tree. We don't know of Christu's fate, but I can't imagine it ended well for him, knowing how Frank usually deals with criminals. Although he did promise that if Christu gave him the information he was looking for, he'd actually be okay, and Frank would use his medic training and knowledge to save his life. Though I personally wouldn't trust that knowledge myself if it was Frank Castle and he did that to me.
Next on the list is the Hulk vs. the Sentry. Okay, this is one of the craziest throwdowns in Marvel history. This one takes place in World War Hulk number 5. So picture this, the Hulk, fueled by rage, obviously, returns to Earth ready to serve some serious payback to those who banished him from the planet. On the flip side, we've got the Sentry, this hero who's holding back because he's terrified of the enormous power he wields. Basically like the Marvel equivalent of Superman here. When these two finally face off, it was like fireworks on the 4th of July. Explosions, chaos, destruction everywhere. The Sentry unleashed his powers, sending the Hulk flying through buildings like they were made of cardboard. But you know the Hulk, he's tough as nails, so he took these hits and dished them right back like a titanic game of ping pong. Now what's mind-boggling here is the sheer power they both brought to the table. They clashed so hard that their energies actually canceled each other out, reverting them both back to their normal human forms. But in the final moments, it was the Hulk who landed the knockout blow on the Sentry. Now even after this fight, the Hulk, still seething with anger, almost tore New York apart just by taking a step. That's how crazy powerful he was, even after tangling with Sentry, so it's kind of safe to say that the Hulk technically won the battle, but man, the strength here on display was off the charts. If you're enjoying this video so far, please support the channel by pressing like, subscribing to Top 10 Nerd, and ringing that notification bell.
Number 8, Uranus vs Magneto. During an X-Men Red tie-in issue for the AXE Judgment Day event, in a fight that lasted barely a page and a half, Uranus completely, and I mean completely, destroys Magneto. And I really do mean literally destroys him. And never mind Magneto, although that brief battle is something to behold, Uranus completely wrecks most of planet Araco too. Well, him and his army, but I mean, still, wrecking a whole planet, that's insane. Well, Magneto would later on get some sweet revenge on Uranus. In the first fight the two have here, Uranus manages to wrench Magneto's heart from his body, seemingly killing him. However, we later learn, of course, that Magneto manages to stay alive to fight another day by, get this, literally controlling the metal in his blood. What? Controlling its flow throughout his body, even without a heart, basically using the iron in his blood to pump the blood throughout his body. That's what? That's crazy.
While Bruce is naturally the core figure in his family tree, the roots of the Hulk's rage actually come from his father, Brian Banner. And without him, there really wouldn't be a Hulk. Now for this point, I'm not really talking about one specific moment, because the brutal part of this is the character of Brian Banner entirely. If there's a villain in this story, it's Brian. He physically and emotionally mistreated his wife Rebecca and their son. As seen in Incredible Hulk number 312 from 1968, Brian became deeply disturbed and obsessed with this idea that his radiation research had turned his son, Bruce, into a little monster. Brian was even responsible for the passing of Rebecca in front of Bruce, which led directly to the development of multiple personalities for Bruce, including the Hulk, which is essentially the personification of rage in a child who has been severely mistreated. Now if I were forced to pick one moment, it would be when Brian actually died, which appeared to be at the hands of Bruce himself in a graveyard, as one does. All of which happened in the Incredible Hulk issue 1, by the way. It's honestly incredibly tragic. Years later, during the Chaos War, Brian actually emerged on Earth as a fearsome Hulk of his own before he was defeated and returned to the afterlife. More recently, Brian made a lot of trouble in Immortal Hulk as a servant or incarnation of the One Below All. Near the end of the Planet Hulk storyline, the shuttle the Hulk was sent to Sakharin by the Illuminati at the beginning of the Planet Hulk storyline blows up, wiping out the Green Scar's wife and child. Hulk reaches a whole new level of anger, which is directed at those who sent him here, the Illuminati. So he headed to Earth with his Warsworn. He made a quick stop on the moon to defeat Black Bolt of the Inhumans, but when he got to Earth he headed to New York, giving the city a time limit to be evacuated, and when that time limit stopped, well, he defeated everyone who was left. Iron Man and the Hulkbuster, the Avengers and their tower, the US Army, the X-Men, Fantastic Four, Juggernaut, Doctor Strange, using the power of Zom. You know, one of the most powerful magical monsters in all of Marvel Comics, all while saving innocent bystanders. He then threw the Illuminati members he captured into the ring against each other, sparing them since he only really sought justice. He was eventually sorta defeated by the Sentry, who he fought until they both reverted back to their human forms, which is when Bruce Banner knocked Bob Reynolds right out. And then the comic version of Niek takes the life of Bruce's friend Rick, and the Hulk just goes absolutely ballistic, creating earthquakes with his footsteps and almost destroying the world. It would appear Tony Stark grew a little tired of getting beat up by the Hulk over the years. This basically came to a breaking point in the Immortal Hulk story when the Hulk faces off against the Avengers and Stark's pretty new Hulkbuster gets completely wrecked. This caused him to use what he referred to as the Big Gun, aka the Helios laser, a massive space laser laced with UV radiation that, when unleashed onto the Hulk during one of his rampages, completely fried the Hulk to dust. When Hulk woke up, since, he's immortal in this story now, he could be terminated, so instead he found that he'd been sliced up with an adamantium razor and placed in a dozen different jars. He had his hand in one, his heart in another, his lungs on another shelf. It's pretty messed up, since a jar with his living head was basically forced to watch as a scientist dissected him further to study. Yeah, no thank you, hard pass. In 1995, Marvel released the last Avengers story, and with a title like that, from 1995, you can imagine it's not exactly all sunshines and rainbows. And you'd be correct. Within the first few pages, the current Avengers of this alternate future and their base are completely wiped out by an absolutely massive explosion caused by Ultron 59. But that's not even the worst part. At some time in the past, this universe's version of the Incredible Hulk turned evil, thanks to an event that happened fighting alongside Thor, The Thing, and Hercules. The Hulk turned against his fellow Avengers, Wonder Man, Hawkeye, Mockingbird, and Tigra, who absolutely got it the worst. Tigra against the Hulk is not a fight you would normally expect, and this comic tells you why. Since in her attack against the Green Goliath, Hulk simply grabs her by her legs and arms and pulls her apart in a scene kind of like Sentry ripping apart Aries in the Siege event, but way scarier and more terrifying. Hawkeye and Mockingbird literally flee for their lives, while Wonder Man flew into a rage and he and the Hulk had a slugfest that ended with Wonder Man detonating and wiping both himself and the Hulk from existence. I know I've already mentioned one instance from the Immortal Hulk storyline that I felt was extremely nuts, but to be quite honest, the entire story is one big brutal collection. What's happening in some of the comic panels is almost hard to even decipher, as the legendary art is grabbing every inch of your attention, with horrifying body horror that I've never really seen in a comic before. There's nothing like this. Moments where he escaped from those jars he had been placed into, and his different displaced parts start merging together around this helpless scientist who basically gets consumed by the body of Hulk, or when the leader basically becomes a horrifying monster swallowing Brian Banner and ripping the Devil Hulk apart, or when Hulk ripped his own face off, or when he mutates into a giant monster at the end of one particular timeline and destroys literally everything in existence, consuming the sentience of the universe. The whole Immortal Hulk run is just pure horror from start to finish, wrapped in an Incredible Hulk wrapping paper.
Coming in at number 10 is Ultimate Captain America vs. Kleiser. The Ultimate Universe has a ton of absolutely insane moments to choose from, all of which would work for this list. But for this point, I want to talk about a time when Captain America went a little bit overboard. In Ultimates number 12, Captain America is caught in a fight with Herr Kleiser, an old German rival. Just for better context, Herr Kleiser is actually one of the Chitauri, and they launched a full-scale invasion of Earth in the modern day, which gave Captain America the opportunity to put Kleiser down for good. So, Herr Kleiser is naked following a fiery explosion, and the two are just going punch for punch, with Kleiser even getting the upper hand and ranting about eating Steve's face, which is weird. After Nick Fury tries to intervene and Kleiser tries to make Cap surrender, Captain America finally gets the upper hand. Now, Captain America pins Kleiser down and lifts his shield above his head and slams it down edge first right into Kleiser's chest, basically slicing him in half. Then, Captain America insults the entire country of France, and it's really weird. Number 9. Captain Marvel vs Thor. During quite possibly Carol Danvers' darkest storyline, The Last Avenger, taking place in Captain Marvel Volume 10, number 12, a living suit controlled by a cosmic villain is forcing Carol to wipe out the Avengers. Issue number 12 opens with Captain Marvel catching Thor, the God of Thunder, off of guard, launching a surprise attack to take him down. But Thor is a god, and it's going to take quite a lot more to bring him down. The two start a battle that sees them tear across the entire planet, from Greenland to Kansas to the middle of the Pacific Ocean and then to space. Thor barely has any idea what's going on, and Carol was just going ham. Carol managed to use an energy beam to send Mjolnir extremely far away into space, and then another massive blast, she managed to incapacitate the God of Thunder and current ruler of Asgard. The final pages of this issue then show Carol displaying Thor's detached head. So yeah, a pretty brutal battle indeed. Blech. Number 8. Iron Man vs the Mandarin. Nothing seems to ever get as intense, as destructive, as a battle between a hero and their nemesis. And in Invincible Iron Man number 28, Tony Stark and what is arguably his most well-known villain, the Mandarin, go head to head. At this time, Mandarin was carrying out a plan to release the extremist virus into the population that would wipe out anyone without a very specific genetic makeup, which was only a very small number of the population, and it would grant those who remained superpowers. Iron Man came into this fight hot and did not cool off until it was over. This fight was a knockdown drag-out fight that saw Iron Man rip the 10 rings from Mandarin's spine, engage in a battle of fisticuffs with this powerful old man, and then finally Stark repulsor-rayed the ever-living lights out of the Mandarin, who then proceeded to sick the extremist virus on Stark, who used a refrigerant to not only halt the virus, but also freeze Mandarin solid. Iron Man then promptly passed out.
Next on the list is Captain America vs the Punisher. During the Civil War comic arc, the Punisher was recruited on Captain America's team for all of like 10 minutes. That all went up in smoke when a couple of goons showed up asking to be a part of the rebellion. Cap was about to let them on the team, but then the Punisher lit him up with bullets before anything could be made official. And that's when Cap snapped. He wailed on Frank Castle like nobody's business. The Punisher tried to reason between punches. After all, they were fighting over the lives of criminals, but that did not stop Cap from giving Castle the beating of a lifetime. Fists, feet, knees, shield, you name it. Treated Frank like a punching bag. But the entire time, it was clear that this fight was a one-sided massacre, with Frank not throwing a single punch and Steve not pulling any of them. Then the moment came when Steve demanded Frank fight back, to which the Punisher replied, "Not against you," ending the fight when Cap walked away. SpiderMan theorized something about Cap being the reason why Frank became a soldier during Vietnam, which is more or less right. The Punisher exists to, well, punish people. He fights against evil, and so Captain America, being the closest thing to an actual good, noble person as anybody has ever seen, and so there was nothing for Frank Castle to punish. Captain America is the Punisher's hero, and so he just let Rogers have his way with him. Totally brutal.
Number 6. Jean Grey vs Cordyceps Jones. Jean Grey is a force to be reckoned with, and not just because she was the host for the Phoenix Force either. Even without the insane power of the Phoenix Force bonded to her, Jean has actually done some pretty impossible things, let's be real, including almost single-handedly defeating Null during the Absolute Carnage event. Yeah, while she ultimately didn't manage that brutal takedown on her own, she was at the very least integral to beating him down the line by helping to uncover the God of the Symbiote's weakness. Jean has been an unstoppable force many times over while serving on the X-Men team. She truly showed how dangerous it is to mess with her when going up against Cordyceps Jones. She defeated him and his entire casino simply by trapping him in an illusion while the X-Men basically did their thing. From within that illusion, Jean says it best when it comes to just how powerful she is, truly, in issue 11 of the recent X-Men series. I was Marvel Girl, now I'm Jean Grey. I did not even let the Phoenix command me, so honestly, what chance do you have?
Next on the list is Null Vs The Century. In King in Black #1, Null shows up on Earth with an army of symbiote dragons, and the Avengers are all like, oh boy, we're in trouble. The Avengers try their best to fight back, but Null is just on another level. On top of the symbiote freaking dragons, he brings these huge celestials covered in symbiotes and goes after Earth, saying he's looking after a guy named Dylan Brock. Even when the Avengers try to bring in the Sentry, their big gun, Null straight up tears him apart and absorbs his insane powers. It's a shocker because Sentry is a powerhouse. I mean, this guy's strength is off the charts, like millions of exploding suns strong. In fact, the dude has ripped gods in half himself. So for Null to just dismantle him like he's nothing, and then to make matters worse, Null covers the Earth in symbiotes, blocks out the sun, and plunges everything into darkness. This Null dude is no joke. He proved he's basically the strongest being in the whole Marvel universe, and taking him down is gonna be one seriously tough job.
Number 4. Sentry vs Aries. Speaking of people ripping each other in half, Sentry is the greatest hero that Earth forgot. In the Marvel universe, as AJ was saying, he's basically like the Marvel equivalent of DC's Superman, but quite a bit more messed up when it comes to his origins and at times his approach to fighting baddies, to be honest. In fact, Sentry himself isn't only one of Earth's greatest and most powerful heroes, he's actually also one of its most powerful and terrifying villains, as residing within him is also the persona of the Void. The Void is the reason the whole world basically had to forget that Bob Reynolds was the hero known as the Sentry. In forgetting who the Sentry was, he disappeared, and with him so did his evil alter ego, the most villainous and deadly Void. Sentry, before getting himself ripped in half by Null, managed to rip Aries in half. That's how powerful and violent he can be. Of course, him getting ripped in half by Null does make sense, because that feels like karma to me, my friends.
Next up is Deadpool vs the Hulk. Okay, so technically speaking, this fight didn't actually happen, as this was all a twisted fantasy made up by Deadpool in his head, but it doesn't make it any less brutally mesmerizing. Deadpool, the merc with the mouth that just won't quit, is brainstorming story ideas with a comic creator in a She-Hulk-esque type sequence, where they're bouncing ideas back and forth, trying to come up with something fresh and exciting for Deadpool's next adventure. About Deadpool's resilience, it's pretty insane. I mean, the dude has faced craziest stuff and managed to bounce back. Like, he's sort of like a cat with 9 lives, except he's got an endless supply of lives. Boat impalement, getting ripped apart by superheroes, getting turned into a cape, you name it, he's probably survived it. So, in this story chat thing, Deadpool suggests fighting the big green Hulk, and lo and behold, the comic shows Hulk literally tearing Deadpool clean in half like he's made of paper mache. In one of Hulk's hands is Deadpool's legs and most of his torso, and in the other hand is his still screaming skull, each segment still connected by cords of his stretched tissue and his freaking spinal column. It's the kind of stuff that makes you wince and go ouch, but it's unfortunately all in Deadpool's head. Like a what if scenario that never really happened, but it showcases just how tough and imaginative this guy can be, even when facing down the Hulk.
Number 2. Taskmaster vs Hyperion. This one is wild, especially when you consider the beating that Taskmaster was allowing himself to take. That's right, while it might seem like Taskmaster is on the losing end of this fight here, he actually does come out on top in the end, despite getting beat down consistently throughout the fight. Spoilers. We get to learn about how he actually had this one in the bag through flashbacks that we're shown during the fight, where it's revealed that Taskmaster's preparation was basically the key here. In the Taskmaster series, in issue number 2, Taskmaster is working with Nick Fury to clear his name, but Tony Masters has to basically do something for Fury first. He needs to collect the kinesic signatures of 3 important individuals, one of whom is actually Phil Coulson. But to get to Phil, he has to go through Hyperion, and in order to do that, he has to first bring Hyperion's guard down, in essence allowing Hyperion to basically punch his way through Taskmaster so that he can do that. Ouch. Taskmaster, through feigning a loss though, is able to get Hyperion to drop his guard enough to get off a single powerful Boomerang Arrow Shot, a Hawkeye classic to be sure, tipped with Hyperion's one weakness based on Fury's intel. So if you ever need to defeat Hyperion, just make sure you keep that on your person at all times.
Coming up next is Gambit vs Captain America. Gambit, the X-Men dude who could turn anything into an explosive, has this epic face-off with Captain America in AVX versus number 2. So here's the deal. Cap is hunting down Hope Summers in the Savage Land, trying to prevent her from hooking up with the destructive Phoenix Force, while the X-Men, on the other hand, they're all about protecting Hope, thinking that the Phoenix could be a win for mutants. Enter Gambit and Cap. Clash time, baby. When Cap and Gambit go at it, Cap's not sweating it, and even when Gambit takes his mitts off on Cap's vibranium shield, charging the shield and sending it towards Cap like a bomb, Cap dodges it easily, and the vibranium shield doesn't combust per se, but boy oh boy does it leave an explosion like you've never seen before. Then Gambit gets sneaky, charging up Cap's superhero suit, which Cap thought was off limits. Gambit essentially turns Cap's entire outfit into a ticking time bomb. Cap's duds get trashed, and he gets serious, unrelentingly advancing towards Gambit, who's throwing everything he has at him at this point. And then that's when we get the grand finale. Boom! Cap's fist connects with Gambit's jaw, he decks Gambit hard, ending the tussle right there. Cap thought it would initially be a walk in the park, but Gambit pulled a pretty sneaky move. Now even though Cap won here, Gambit made him break a sweat, to be sure. That's how a simple tactic and a surprise move turned up the heat in this showdown. First up is Zeus vs Hulk. Sometimes readers need a little bit of a reminder of the power hierarchy in the Marvel Universe, and sometimes it's the characters themselves who need reminding. The Hulk went up to Mount Olympus demanding Zeus to fix stuff after a big war, and Zeus just wasn't having it and zapped Hulk down hard. But Hulk is tough, so even after getting hit by that mega lightning bolt, he kept on going. Hulk threw some serious punches at Zeus, but Zeus hit back even harder, like super hard. Hulk got sent flying off of Mount Olympus, but even that wasn't enough. He crawled all the way back up to Zeus for round 2. Zeus, no longer playing around, smacks the Hulk down so dang hard that he can't help but spew green bodily fluids all over the place. I mean, imagine shattering the Hulk's ribcage so hard that his lungs collapse. Good lord. Then Zeus really lays into the Hulk, making him crash down into the mountain, where he got stuck on a rock and knocking him unconscious. When the Hulk finally awoke, he found himself chained up and left for vultures to chow down on him. Zeus was gloating, watching Hulk's super healing power keep him alive, while the birds had a feast on his stomach. Classic Zeus. At number 9 is Daken vs The Punisher. One of the most brutal fights ever involves Daken, Wolverine's son. So Daken goes all out on Punisher, not holding back on an ounce of his brutality. It's a story where the Punisher gets cornered and Daken just goes berserk on him. You see, at first, the Punisher starts off okay and takes control of the fight pretty early, but that doesn't last very long. The Punisher quickly gets overwhelmed by Daken and meets one of the most brutal ends I have ever seen in comics. Because basically, Daken just chops him up into pieces, limb by limb, and then insults him before kicking those pieces off of the rooftop. It's gruesome. Now the scary part is that Daken doesn't show any remorse or regret for what he's done. He's just like that, a troublemaker who doesn't hold back. And this wasn't just some trick or plan by Punisher to fake his demise. No, this is the real deal. Later on, Daken kind of changes sides, tries to be a hero, and joins the Wolverine family. But he's got this dark side that pops up from time to time. Like for example, that one time when he snuck off to Krakoa to get vengeance on those who hurt innocent mutants. He's got this cruelty streak that sets him apart, making him one of the deadliest fighters in Marvel. So even though he's on the hero team now, don't forget that Daken can be seriously deadly when he wants to be. If you're enjoying this video so far, please support the channel by pressing like, subscribing to Top 10 Nerd, and ringing that notification bell. At number 8 is Thanos vs Black Bolt. Now, Thanos in the MCU is a pretty tough guy, able to take on Cap, Thor, and Iron Man at the same freaking time, but in the comics? He's an even bigger deal. Now let's talk about Black Bolt. He's an Inhuman and his voice is crazy powerful. I'm talking one whisper from this guy can vaporize Doctor Strange and the Sentry. Yeah, the Sentry, who's basically Marvel's version of Superman. And get this, he can even wipe out an entire planets just by using his voice. Now, this guy's voice is so lethal, he's been trained not to speak, like, ever. Not even in his sleep. That's how intense it is. Now, what happens when he tries to let loose on Thanos? Spoiler alert? Nothing. Not a scratch. Thanos barely flinches. It's like watching a bug bounce off of a windshield. Thanos takes a full-on shout from Black Bolt at point-blank range, and you know what happens? Thanos sticks his arm out, wraps his hand around Black Bolt's mouth, silencing him. Then he silences Black Bolt for good, slamming his face into the ground beneath him repeatedly. Black Bolt, as tough as he is, has no shot here. Thanos barely even broke a sweat. It's a brutal beatdown, a real mismatch, as Thanos came out without a scratch.
Number 7, Captain America versus Captain America. We all battle our own inner demons once in a while, but for Captain America, he had to literally face his own evil self. In the Secret Empire storyline, a Hydra-loving version of Steve Rogers, lovingly referred to as Stevel, had managed to take control of the entire United States, committing seriously heinous acts to ensure his success. Luckily, with the help of Kobik and Captain America's family of heroes, the regular Steve Rogers that we know and love managed to make it back to our reality, and he and Stevel finally went head-to-head in Secret Empire number 10. While Stevel had a completely different ideology than Captain America, he still retained all of his skill and tactical know-how, and was armed with a very Iron Man-like armor, which made this fight one of the most intense hand-to-hand fights I have ever seen in a comic in a hot minute. While the two are evenly matched in terms of skill, Stevel is evil, and Cap is decidedly not evil, which means that Captain America is very much worthy of wielding the hammer of Thor, and Stevel was only capable of wielding disappointment. Number 6, Thanos Vs The Champion. The comic story known as Thanos Quest essentially recounts exactly how Thanos went about acquiring the Infinity Stones from across the universe. Now, Thanos faced various challenges and challengers to acquire each stone. The Power Stone specifically was held by a guy known as the Champion, an elder of the universe just like the Collector and the Grand Master. Thanos came upon Champion on a planet that is constantly fought over by 5 different factions, and he's just here fighting scores of soldiers for his own amusement. Thanos just swoops in and challenges Champion to a fight, which the Elder accepts without a second thought. Now, while Champion, powered by the Infinity Stone, is much more powerful than Thanos, he's effectively an idiot. Like, he didn't even know that the stone was the thing giving him his unlimited power. Thanos outthought Champion multiple times, even allowing Champ to destroy the entire planet that they were fighting on. Thanos didn't beat up Champion, but he outsmarted and embarrassed the guy to the point Champion traded the power gem for a toe to another planet. What an idiot. Number 5, Doom vs Thanos. Somehow, my fellow nerd compatriots have failed to recognize the sheer might and power that is Doom. Victor Von Doom has some of the best moments in Marvel Comics, and some of the beatings he puts down on other characters throughout are definitely worthy of this list. When Doom was ruler of Battleworld in the most recent Secret Wars event, very few could challenge his rule, but one who was foolish enough to do so was the Mad Titan Thanos. Thanos, being the rightly smug, extremely powerful Mad Titan he is, decides to challenge Doom straight on and refuses all of Doom's offers to just work with him. Thanos goes on a little rant about how when he had the Infinity Gauntlet, he acted as a god and he called Doom a weak god. In retort, Doom goes, and do you have the Infinity Gauntlet now? To which Thanos replies, I do not, but I remain Thanos the Great Tyrant, and for you, that will be enough. That was stupid, because then, in one quick move, Doom simply plunges his hand into Thanos' chest, grabs a hold of his spine, and turns his body to ash as he says, that appears untrue. And it's just one of the greatest comic book panels I have ever seen. Number 4, Doom vs Spider-Man. Carrying along the Dr. Doom hype train, in Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, number 349 and 350, Dr. Doom and Spider-Man faced off, and it did not go well for the wall crawler. This time, Spidey was tracking a jewel thief named the Black Fox, but the Black Fox also had a certain Latvian ruler hot on his tail as well, as he had also bartered one of Victor Von Doom's family heirlooms, an emerald passed down to him by his late mother. And if you know anything about Dr. Doom, you never mess with anything related to Dr. Doom's mama. Doom flew to New York and just happened to catch up with the Black Fox at the same time that Spider-Man did. When Spidey intervened on the Black Fox's behalf, Dr. Doom did not hold back. Doom nonchalantly thrashed the web-slinger, leaving him with his costume in tatters and desperately scrambling away for his life. While he convinced Doom to allow him time to retrieve his family heirloom, Peter's severe beating had left him concussed, so much so that he even hallucinated Uncle Ben. The beating he took taught Spidey an important lesson about recognizing his limits. Coming in at number 3 today is Dr. Doom vs Reed Richards. But alas, Doctor Doom is a villain, and therefore he has been defeated quite a few times. Quite possibly up there as one of the best one-on-one fights between Doctor Doom and his nemesis Mr. Fantastic came to us in Fantastic Four 1961 number 200, when these two college rivals resorted to a battle of fisticuffs. It was intense, with Doom characteristically monologuing the whole time. Even with Richards using his elastic body to try and overwhelm Doom, he fought Richards off, pummeling the man and eventually getting his metal gloves around Reed's throat. Unfortunately, one of Doctor Doom's biggest weaknesses is his own face. Thanks to his power source short-circuiting, the lock to Doom's mask was weakened, giving Reed the chance to pull it off, revealing Doom's face to a room full of mirrors. The lenses from Doom's mask couldn't protect him from the solar-powered intensified reflections and drove him just a little bit bonkers. On one hand, Doctor Doom beat the snot out of Reed Richards, but Reed psychologically crippled Doctor Doom in one fell move. Number 2. Black Tarantula vs Spider-Man. So showing up in the Amazing Spider-Man 432, Black Tarantula seemingly attacks our spider hero out of nowhere, chucking half a chimney at him as his first move. Now, while Spider-Man tries to figure out who the heck this guy is and why he's even after Spider-Man, he is dodging out of the way of optic blasts, massive punches, and even his own webs do nothing as Tarantula just rips through them like tissue paper. Spider-Man even has a whole flashback about how Mary Jane wanted him to quit being Spider-Man, which was interrupted as Black Tarantula smashes through the wall Spider-Man was standing on. Spider-Man ends up floating down to an alley, and while he gets maybe 2 or 3 punches on Tarantula, when the villain gets his hands on Spider-Man's ankle, it's all over. He slams Peter between the alleyway walls, then down onto the pavement, and then he literally rips off Peter's mask, revealing his bruised face before telling him that he is sparing him so he can find Norman Osborn's missing child. But when he has done so, Spider-Man needs to leave New York for good. He then just walks off, leaving Peter in the fetal position, counting his injuries and thanking his lucky stars that he is alive. And finally, in a number 1 today is Moon Knight vs Bushmaster. During Charlie Huston's 2006 run of the Moon Knight comics, in the 2nd issue, Mark Spector recalls how he ended up in a wheelchair. And it was all because of his little fight that he had with his nemesis, Bushmaster. In a flashback, the two are brutally fighting each other along the rooftops until Bushmaster savagely throws Mark off of the roof and he crashes down, bouncing on and off of a fire escape below, breaking and crushing both of his knees at the same time. It is brutal with a capital B, but this is Moon Knight. Thinking he'd won, Bushmaster comes in for the final hit, but Mark lands multiple crescent darts deep in the villain's neck. But then, Mark isn't finished. He then climbs on top of his nemesis and using another dart, he relieves Bushmaster of his own face, giving him a look that resembles what his mask used to be, a face with the skin removed.
Number 10. The Inheritors. The Inheritors are Morland's crew and family. The clan Morland himself is also a part of. They're a powerful energy vampire clan which hunt down various totems and consume them. Because yeah, there aren't just spider totems out there apparently. I want to know though, are there anteater totems, and can I be one? Please write me into a comic as an anteater totem, someone. Please. Spider totems, for those who don't know, are spider folks from across the multiverse who are basically destined to end up being connected to the spirit of the spider, either possessing powers related to the spider or some other important connection which generally gives them purpose. The Inheritors ended up getting control over the Master Weaver and used their knowledge and power to traverse the multiverse and hunt down spider totems within it. The Inheritors are generally led by Solus or Morland, and the clan has included Verna, Genix, Karn, Bora, Brix, Dara, Deimos, Malos, Mortia, Namura, and Thanos. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not show us you love us by clicking that like button? Seriously, it feeds the algorithm and it feeds my soul. Number 9. Miriam Drew, or rather, a bunch of Miriam Drews. Miriam's Drews. Many of them. An army of them. A clone army of Miriam Drews. Who was Miriam Drew, you might be asking? Jessica Drew's mother. In the previous Spider-Woman series by Carlo Pacheco and Pere Perez, Jessica had to face off against a bunch of her mom's clones, after learning that the woman whose base she was in wasn't really her mother, but instead a clone of her. After watching her mom go from loving and considerate, seemingly having missed her daughter, to violent and aggressive, blaming Jessica for basically everything that had gone wrong in her life, Jessica then basically had to fight off an entire army of her mom's clones, ultimately. Like Jess at the time, her clone moms were also juicing, which also made them scary foes to face both in form and in power. If you don't believe me, read the series. Number 8. Zodiac. Zodiac is a blast from the past. He was a villain who was first introduced in 2010, but only recently reappeared in the comics, pledging to become Moon Knight's sworn nemesis. A very different vibe from Raul Bushman, honestly. Zodiac reminds me more of Joker or Deadpool when it comes to his antics. He's both brilliant, but also criminally insane. But it is his penchant for creative and deadly thinking that makes him honestly so dangerous. Like when he took on Moon Knight's ally, Reese, a vampire, not with a cross around his neck, but instead wearing his own name around his neck, as he clarified that it actually wasn't the cross vampires were weak to, it was faith, and Zodiac believes devoutly in only one thing: Zodiac.
At number 7, Punisher ends Doctor Doom. This one is absolutely brutal. You know, for as big as a bad guy as Doctor Doom is, it really doesn't take much for Frank Castle to absolutely obliterate him. And fairly easily too. This comes from the Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe comics. See, Castle isn't just up against Doom, but all of his Doom bots as well. However, they're all being remotely piloted by Doom, which means so long as Frank can fry the circuitry in Doom's noggin, the feedback loop easily takes care of the rest of the robots. Seriously, Doc, you should have used AI or Wi-Fi or something. All it takes is for Frank to slap a magnetic landmine on Dr. Doom's metal face, making his entire head burst into flames. But even a direct explosion to the face isn't enough to make a dent in that thick metal skull of his, so Frank resorts to a more brutal approach. With Dr. Doom incapacitated, Frank takes a steel hammer off the castle walls and tells Doom not to worry, as the two of them have all the time in the world. From outside of the castle walls, loud clanging can be heard like a bell as Punisher wails down on Doom's face. Clang, 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 squish. At number 6 is Deadpool versus an entire Armageddon. In this wild and emotional Marvel storyline, Deadpool's dad mode kicked in hard. So Deadpool, the wild and wacky mercenary, found his daughter was in danger. He had been through heaps of chaos and finally he had lost his chance at family bliss. But then, his daughter was alive and yet still under threat, so when the bad guys, the Ultimatum, tried to take her out, Deadpool just couldn't take it anymore. He knew so long as he was Deadpool, the trouble magnet, his family would never be safe, so he made a heartbreaking choice, luring all of Ultimatum, like the whole army, to a showdown. And he went absolutely berserk. He used tech from Tony Stark, blew up choppers, drove drones into the ground, and went on a rampage like no other, fighting for his daughter with everything he had, but in the end, it cost him his life. Deadpool went out in a blaze of glory protecting his family. At number 5 is Thor versus Iron Man. In the comics, you'll notice a certain god of thunder was missing from the entire Civil War ordeal, and that's because at the time, Thor was deceased, but not for long, of course, because this is comic books we're talking about. Now, during this time, Iron Man was kind of a big shot running the show at S.H.I.E.L.D. and taking charge after winning the first Civil War. Captain America seemed out of the picture, and Stark even went out of his way to make a clone of Thor, which he used to lie to the world, saying Thor supported his cause. But then Thor came back, and he was not happy. Iron Man rolled in, thinking he could get Thor to join his team and follow the government's orders, but Thor was just not having it, especially with Iron Man acting all bossy and making clones of him and whatnot. So Thor shows him what's what. He thrashes Iron Man's super fancy suit, striking him multiple times with lightning and leaving him defenseless. Gripping Tony by the throat, Thor reminds Tony just who's the god and who's the puny mortal. Iron Man tries to smooth things over by offering Thor diplomatic immunity for Asgard. With his most powerful suit completely trashed, Tony ends up hitchhiking a ride back to town in the back of a pickup truck. At number 4, Spider-Man vs. Phoenix Colossus and Phoenix Magic. So the Phoenix Force is this super duper powerful energy which got split into 5 pieces by Iron Man's invention during the Avengers vs. X-Men brawl. These bits of the Phoenix Force energy latched onto some of the X-Men, giving them crazy amounts of power, like basically turning them into walking, talking hurricanes of strength. Among these supercharged X-Men were Colossus and Magic. both with their powers cranked up to 11. Colossus is this big tough dude whose skin is organic steel, basically making him a walking tank. Magic, on the other hand, can teleport and has some seriously magical mojo going on. These characters are obscenely powerful in their own right, let alone powered by a fifth of the Phoenix Force. Talk about OP. Now, Spider-Man gets stuck facing these two juggernauts who are basically gods at this point. To battle them in single-handed combat would spell his doom, but Spider-Man does it anyway. He won't back down for the sake of his friends, no matter how many times he gets hit. But man, these guys were just too much for him. They pounded him hard, cracking his bones and leaving him barely able to breathe, let alone stand. It was a complete beatdown, and it certainly was sickening. Every one of Colossus's 4 punches crushed Spider-Man's head to a pile of bloody pulp. His spine was completely shattered. But here's where it gets nuts. Spider-Man, even though he's all beaten up, nay, completely crushed, refuses to give in. He knows that he clearly can't outmuscle them, so he pulls a genius move, tricking Colossus and Magic into fighting each other, making them knock the Phoenix Force right out of themselves. So at the end of the day, Spider-Man emerges victorious, not because he's the strongest, but because he's the smartest and most stubborn hero around. And yeah, he is stubborn. He didn't have to do all this, but he did it to help the Avengers escape. So selfless. That's why we love Spider-Man. He gets beaten many times more than you can count, but he never gives up and always manages to win somehow. At number 3 is Punisher vs Wolverine. In a wild comic book series, Punisher and Wolverine tangled in a brutal showdown where Punisher, feeling cornered, went to extreme lengths to take down this unrelenting mutant. First up, he used a shotgun to blow off Wolverine's face, which is a huge deal. I mean, not so much because of Wolverine's crazy fast healing factor. Even with his face half gone, Logan was still standing, so the Punisher decided to go even further in the next issue, aiming low and wiping out Wolverine's gonads. Talk about hitting below the belt where it hurts, but then there's more! You see, the Punisher was desperate to buy time, and so he went full throttle. He didn't just stop at the face or the man parts, no. He rolled over Wolverine with a steamroller, squashing him flat like a pancake. Now, obviously, Logan still manages to survive, which is obviously some serious level toughness, but that did knock him out of the fight for a good while. Now this whole thing shows how insanely tough Wolverine is, surviving stuff that would put anybody else down for good. At number 2 is Spider-Man vs Kingpin in Back in Black. The clash with the Kingpin illuminated a different facet of the web-slinger's character, notably during the Civil War arc in Marvel Comics. With Aunt May's life hanging in the balance due to Kingpin's orchestration, Peter found himself pushed beyond his usual moral thresholds. Striking a severe blow to the crime lord within the confines of a prison, Peter chose not to extinguish Kingpin's life. Instead, he dealt a far more nuanced form of retribution. In his relentless beating, Peter publicly stripped the Kingpin of his aura of invincibility and dominance. This action was more than just physical harm. It was an exhibition of psychological warfare too, revealing that the most impactful defeat can occur within the realms of perception and identity, rather than the purely physical. Though, I will say, it was physical. The message conveyed was super profound. By choosing not to end Kingpin's life, Spider-Man opted for a fate some might deem more excruciating: the knowledge of being bested in front of your peers, stripping away his veneer of invulnerability. And at number 1 is Magneto vs Wolverine. Magneto vs Wolverine in X-Men 25 was a brutal showdown. Magneto, with his insane magnetic powers, isn't exactly the ideal match for Wolverine. I mean, it's like pitting a Magikarp against a Jolteon. Like, come on, it's a one-sided massacre here. But Wolverine is tough as nails. He never backs down from a fight, even if it's not the smartest matchup. Now, this particular time, Magneto went all out, unleashing his full magnetic fury on Wolverine's adamantium-coated skeleton, basically ripping the near-indestructible adamantium right off of Wolverine's bones, tearing it through his flesh, leaving chunks of it sticking out from all over his body. That didn't kill Wolverine. His super healing factor kicked in, barely managing to get through the pain. But for fans, that was a gut punch. The adamantium was a huge part of Wolverine's identity, more than just his healing factor. It's what made him stand out, and for Magneto to just yank that away so casually, was devastating.
Kicking us off today is Marvel's Civil War event. This whole event kicked off because of a guy named Nitro. This villain has the power to explode, and when he did this, hopped up on a new substance, he wiped out the entire town of Stamford, Connecticut. This split the entire superhuman community down the middle, with Tony Stark leading half of them under the idea of superhuman registration, and Captain America leading the other half who opposed this. Wolverine partnered up with the former, and he was given a very specific task: to track down Nitro and bring him to justice. But when Wolverine actually managed to track the guy down, the villain did what he does best: explode. And when it happened here, he managed to completely incinerate Wolverine down to his shiny adamantium bones. But speaking of Wolverine's shiny bones, they did in fact lose their luster at one point, and that was more than brutal enough for this list. In the 1993 crossover event Fatal Attractions, Magneto was offering mutants sanctuary on his ship, the Avalon, and recovering from the legacy virus he was planning to completely wipe out humanity, being opposed only by the X-Men. Xavier, in a special Shi'ar suit, leads the fight against Magneto on Avalon, and Magneto holds everyone off until Wolverine gets the drop on him. Wolverine makes it really close, slicing Magneto across the chest just a little bit too close for comfort, and this pushes Magneto over the edge. He basically turns the adamantium on Wolverine's skeleton into liquid and quite literally pulls it out of his body. It's gruesome. But there is actually more than one character to take on the Wolverine name. X-23's origin story was told in the 2004 miniseries X-23 Innocence Lost, which takes Laura Kinney from conception to independence, and man does she go through the ringer. Laura, unlike most of the other mutants, was created in a lab. This lab was called the Facility, and it's where attempts were being made to clone Wolverine/Weapon X from a recovered sample of his own DNA. The problem is that the sample was incomplete, resulting in constant failures. It was the work of a brilliant geneticist named Sarah Kinney that finally made the project a success when she combined her own DNA with that of the sample to create a genetic replica with near identical powers to the original Wolverine. This clone became labeled X-23, but Sarah secretly named her Laura. X-23 was trained from birth to be an assassin, treated fairly extremely and exposed to a trigger scent that would cause her to lose all control and give in to a brutal rage. The organization used this trigger scent to have her wipe out her sensei, as well as to make money off of her as an 11-year-old super assassin. Now eventually her mother, for lack of a better term, realized that she needed to free Laura. Plus, she also learned that the facility was creating more clones, intending to train them in the same way, and she decided that she needed to take them all out. Thanks to Sarah, X-23 managed to destroy the facility and the clones, but as she escaped, she discovers that the facility have put the trigger scent on her own mother. Sarah ends up being taken out by Laura herself, passing away in her arms before X-23 finally gets to escape. But if we really want to dive into the brutality of Wolverine, we can look directly at Weapon X. A large chunk of Wolverine's life was spent being forced to work for the ultra-shady government group known as Weapons Plus/Weapon X. They are the ones that gave Wolverine those shiny adamantium bones that we talked about at the beginning of the list. Not only did they force Wolverine and many others into nasty experiments to create super soldiers, they then hired out those super soldiers to the highest bidders, brainwashing these people into committing terrible atrocities. For example, Wolverine was forced to steal a boy named Frank Simpson and begin programming him to turn him into an enhanced killer. But then later on in life, Wolverine came across Frank in Vietnam as a soldier, and their interaction was anything but pleasant. Wolverine basically put Frank through the ringer, physically and psychologically, breaking him to the point that Frank became a killer and started going by the name Nuke, which is when he became a Daredevil villain.
Number 7. Tyler Stone. Alchemax is a future villainous corporation from the 2099 Marvel Universe of Earth 928. But of course, a corporation is only ever as evil as the people behind it. One of which is, of course, Tyler Stone, the Vice President of Alchemax's R&D department. Tyler Stone is not only VP of Research and Development at Alchemax, but he is also secretly Miguel O'Hara's, aka SpiderMan 2099's, biological father. Miguel doesn't learn until later on that he is Stone's son, and ends up working for Alchemax as a brilliant geneticist. When he tries to leave, however, it is Stone who slips him the highly addictive and expensive substance, Rapture, made exclusively by Alchemax, to prevent him from leaving. Fortunately, Miguel manages to free himself by becoming his own experimental test subject, accidentally becoming the spider-like hero, Spider-Man 2099. Number 6. Zombie Ant-Man. In the Marvel Zombies world, Black Panther was one of the sole survivors when the zombies first attacked, and turned most of his friends into zombified versions of themselves. One such former friend, Hank Pym, actually just managed to trick T'Challa into coming with him. Or well, he almost did. Either way, Hank managed to trick T'Challa enough to get him to a place where he could basically incapacitate him and then hide him away. Having already begun to change himself, Hank basically planned to use Black Panther, his friend, as a food source. Because Hank is a genius, which means when he's a zombie, he's a really dangerous genius. Hank kept him locked away and alive while slowly savoring and devouring his friend. Fortunately, Black Panther would escape and even become the leader of a land of survivors, although he would eventually turn into a zombie himself, much later on. But lesson learned, watch out for zombie Hank Pym if there's a zombie apocalypse. Number 5. Taskmaster. In the comics, Tony Masters is Taskmaster, and he is well known as an Avengers villain. And it is through his clashes with that team that Taskmaster also became a recurring villain of Hawkeye as well. Now, you might not know it to just look at Taskmaster, but the two have had some pretty epic fights over the years, with Masters himself also possessing marksmanship skills to rival that of, get this, Hawkeye himself, and also being known as a villain who is proficient with the use of a bow and trick arrows. In the comics, Taskmaster has an eidetic memory, or a photographic memory, that also extends to him being able to replicate pretty much any abilities or skill sets that he sees. So while he can also mimic Hawkeye's skills and abilities, he can also match the fighting style of pretty much anyone he watches, as well as learn their specific skill set too, just from watching it, as long as it isn't a superpower specific skill like, you know, flying. Taskmaster is also known for being a brilliant tactician as a mercenary, and often uses strategic thinking to take down opponents who are more powerful than him, which is why he's one you honestly need to watch out for. Number 4. Xemnu. Xemnu is also known as the Living Hulk, and is a being that uses hypnosis powers to take control of others' minds. On more than one occasion, he has attempted to use these powers to try and conquer Earth and bend the minds of its entire populace to his will. In fact, while he's also attempted this feat in the pages of Immortal Hulk, this was also something he tried in his very first appearance. Back then, he was trying to mind control the human race in order to get them to build a ship to basically return him home. Doesn't sound like such an evil plan until you realize the force that the ship would have to create would basically rip the Earth asunder once that ship took off, due to the great force that it would need for that launch. So, pretty evil. Number 3. High Evolutionary. As we saw in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the High Evolutionary is truly a villain to be feared. And honestly, when I found out that the High Evolutionary was going to be in the MCU, I was like, man, that's gonna be lame, because on paper, he's another kind of silly character, especially when you consider that he's often used as a scapegoat for retcons, bizarre origins, and honestly pretty weird plot points. The fact remains though, the High Evolutionary, as the film proves, is truly the be-all and end-all of Marvel's mad science department, and the god complex he has in the MCU basically sums up so beautifully what is so frightening about him when you really think about it. He thinks he's perfecting life, when really he's basically warping and polluting it. Number 2. Thane. Thane is Thanos' son, and while he might not look that intimidating, he's definitely proven himself to be deadly in the past. Initially, Thanos was hunting down Thane because he feared Thane's potential power surmounting his own. He's basically afraid that Thane will rise up and overtake him, but in the end this wasn't something that Thanos really had to be particularly afraid of, it turned out. Even after he became empowered with the Phoenix Force, Thanos still managed to somehow defeat Thane, and this was also at a point when Thanos seemed himself to kind of be dying. Thane ended up being stripped of the Phoenix Force and ended up sentenced to suffering a hell-like existence in the God Quarry for the rest of his life. Or at least until some writer remembers he's still down there and decides to pull him back up again. Thane was also an Inhuman, and his powers are actually perfect for someone who is known to be Thanos' son, and are also pretty OP, I gotta say. He had a death touch ability that, while untamed, basically killed anyone within a certain radius, and he could also trap people in a state of living death through encasing them in amber, which honestly sounds awful. Honestly, while he's in prison for now, I'd watch out whenever he gets out of that God Quarry and is free again. Number 1. Monarch. I feel like we're always sleeping somewhat on Jamie Braddock here, and we honestly don't talk about him enough, so I'm gonna bump him up to the top spot this time around. Monarch to you. Monarch is known for his reality warping powers, and while not always a villain, most of the time in the comics he has basically been a villain. What makes him different from other reality warping characters, and namely mutants out there? Monarch's powers work on a quantum level, and although there are people who can influence Monarch's powers by manipulating his mind, he also is pretty powerful as someone who can basically just make things happen by thinking them into existence. Yeah. He is the elder brother of twins Brian and Elizabeth Braddock, but despite being related to heroes, he seldom is one himself. The end of the Hellion series has to be one of the most brutal things I've ever read. It was actually painful for me to read. My heart seriously hurt after finishing that series, and I was in tears for honestly most of the last issue. To watch this team of lovable but extremely weird misfits come together over multiple issues throughout this series, only to see many of them slip and self-destruct, was honestly something else. They had found a sense of family, only to lose that newfound family, and with it, for many of them, honestly their sense of hope. It was a brutal ending to what was otherwise honestly an uplifting story. I still can't believe that's how it ended, honestly. Zeb Wells out here just playing with my emotions, playing with my heart. I think the worst character for me in terms of how the story ended for them was honestly Wildchild, who basically decided to just accept that he didn't really belong anywhere and submitted to being in a medicated stupor. It really was tragic. What stories have moved you emotionally? For me, Wildchild's and the Hellions ending overall just literally brought me to tears. I actually struggled to read the pages. That's how much I was crying at the end of this series. It was really heartbreaking and really brutal. This is a traumatic one, or at least it probably was a traumatic one for Wolverine at least. Yep, we're talking about that moment. The moment when Wolverine was permanently separated from his adamantium. What are we talking about here? Divorce, babe. Divorce. Wolverine was divorced basically here from his adamantium, something that initially in the comics was suggested to be part of his mutant power. However, over time, of course, we'd come to learn that the adamantium-coated skeleton that he had, his claws, was not necessarily inherent, but was instead put in place by Weapon X. He did have claws, but they were just bone claws, and then Weapon X basically modified him and coated his whole skeleton in adamantium. When the X-Men faced off against Magneto in space, Magneto used his magnetic mutant powers to manipulate this metallic substance, this adamantium, fully removing it from Wolverine's skeleton. He'd get it back, but the extremely gruesome and painful de-adamantium process would leave its mark, making Wolverine more animalistic soon afterwards. Professor X has a lot of brutal moments in the comics. Honestly, he is tied to many of them because he has done some morally questionable things throughout his comic book history. One of these moments, however, might seem small in comparison to some larger missteps that he's had, but it still shocks me to this day, and I find it honestly quite brutal in a different way, so I'm gonna include it here. We're talking about Professor X admitting his feelings for Jean Grey. This wasn't something that Professor X shared aloud, but just seeing it confessed to, even in a thought bubble, was honestly enough for me. Now granted, at the time, I doubt this would have been as shocking when this comic was released, because it was issue number 3 of X-Men, considering that canon had not yet established that Jean was actually one of the Professor's really first X-Men, who he'd helped when she was only a little kid and he was a young adult. But given the context I had when I read this, yeah, it's a mess. One of the most brutal fights I've seen in a while is the one where Storm faces off against Tarn. Tarn the Uncaring is one of the mutants from Morocco, and he happens to be one of the most upsetting to face. Honestly, because of his mutant powers. Also, he's a mutant of Morocco, so they tend to be made of just tougher stuff in general. But really what makes his fights in general brutal are, honestly, his powers. Tarn can basically alter folks' genetic makeup, which is exactly what he does to take Storm's powers away after challenging her to a fight, or rather, after insulting her authority as Regent of Morocco, which she interprets basically as a challenge. And honestly, rightfully so. She responds in kind by saying she will see him in the circle for the two of them to duke it out between them for who should sit as regent, or rather, maybe just who should respect who. Now, when they do, Tarn uses his powers to take away Storm's powers and disfigure her, but still she manages to best him by stabbing him in the chest and threatening to end his life by puncturing his heart. Yeah, Storm, even when she doesn't have powers, she's a really amazing fighter, so you should not mess with her. She forces him to yield, and in the end he learns just how strong-willed Storm is and ultimately returns her powers to her, admitting she is of Morocco and perhaps she might even be of a Ment. That's how intense she is.
Now, while Wolverine spent time on the X-Men team, he came into contact with one Dr. Hank McCoy, aka Beast. Hank is one of the 8 smartest people in the world, and being smart in comic books seems to be a pretty easy path to being morally dubious. Don't get me wrong though, Wolverine is not a Boy Scout by any stretch of the imagination, but he still holds on to his morals, for the most part. Wolverine and Beast were actually friends, and Beast stuck with Wolverine during the Schism event, and he was also on the side of the Avengers with Wolverine during the Avengers vs X-Men event. But people change, and Beast is absolutely one of those people. In order to deal with external threats to the new mutant nation of Krakoa, Beast has taken a position as the chief of the intelligence agency X-Force, which has almost completely cost him his morality. McCoy has chosen some questionably authoritarian actions to guarantee the Krakoan sovereignty, like sabotaging the country of Terra Verde, squirreling away funds to open a space station prison, and interrupting one of Wolverine's resurrections to attach an obedience collar to send him on clandestine missions, all of which was kept secret from the rest of X-Force and the rest of the mutants. This ticked off Wolverine, which in turn ticked off Beast even more. He sent Wolverine on a mission so that he would be captured for an auction that Hank attended, and then he literally showed Wolverine to the afterlife in order to resurrect Logan again in a primitive state and turn him into Weapon X, where Beast sent him on more and more missions. Beast cloned Wolverine, and he used those clones as his own personal bodyguards and hitmen, and man, Beast has just become straight up a villain. No other way to put it. But Beast is nowhere near the most brutal villain that Wolverine has had to face. The Wolverine villain known as Cyber, for example, is one of the only villains to actually terrify Wolverine, with some adamantium-coated skin, toxic claws, and the power to track an individual's brain. And he's like 9 feet tall. In 1994's Wolverine number 79, Cyber is tracking down Wolverine in order to claim his adamantium bones, which he wants to then make a profit from. Unfortunately, at this time, Wolverine actually doesn't have his adamantium bones because Magneto took them away. So when the fight leads to him popping his bone claws, Cyber is a little more than disappointed. But instead of just walking away after this revelation, a cannon just goes off in the distance, and this gives Wolverine the opportunity to slash Cyber across the face. But as soon as the attack happens, Cyber catches Wolverine's fist, and in one stomp, he snaps Wolverine's claws in half, very much like Sabretooth did in Wolverine Origins, like the movie. That event scarred Wolverine, but right after, it made him even question his ability to be a hero in the first place. But moving on from that, the Thing is one of the most powerful heroes in the Marvel Universe, able to stand toe-to-toe with the Hulk in battle. He and Wolverine have had their scrapes, and most of the time, Logan's been on the losing side. In one little altercation taking place in Fantastic Four 1961, issue 374, Wolverine, Ghost Rider, Professor Hulk, and SpiderMan, who had previously taken the place of the Fantastic Four, were hunting for Johnny Storm, who had accidentally destroyed part of Empire State University. Now this led to an altercation between the four heroes and the Fantastic Four, but when Wolverine went to attack Susan Storm, Ben Grimm grabbed the Canadian and slammed him into the ground, calling him an arrogant little creep, because that's just what he does. But Wolverine, in his rage, used all of his might and he slashed Ben across the face, disfiguring the character in a huge way. Now the Thing got his payback as he yelled, "You frickin' little psycho," and then he whacks Wolverine with one punch, sending him flying through a bunch of buildings, but this actually scarred the Thing so bad that it had lasting effects throughout the comics. The post-apocalyptic world featured in the Old Man Logan storyline is one of the best things that Marvel has given us. But it's also one of the most brutal settings they've ever created. It all came to be when the villains decided that instead of fighting their usual villains, who they always lose to, they would instead put themselves up against whatever hero they were actually best suited to face. Now in the case of Wolverine, who is the main character here, that happened to be Mysterio. Mysterio is a master of creating illusions that trick even the senses, and he is almost always defeated by Spider-Man because of his spider sense. But for Logan, his super senses are one of his key traits, so when Mysterio uses his illusions to trick those senses into believing that the X-Mansion was being attacked by Doc Ock, Ulysses Klaue, Strife, and a whole squad of powerful villains, Wolverine believed it wholeheartedly and he held nothing back. Using his claws, he cut through the villains like butter. With all the other X-Men nowhere to be found, it was Wolverine versus everyone, and he was taking 40 different villains to the grave. It was insane. insane. When he finally took down the last one, who was Bullseye, the illusion actually lifted to reveal that these villains were in actuality all his fellow X-Men, who were just caught completely off guard by the sudden attack from one of their own. Now there are a few different characters who often appear in the Wolverine circle, the Wolverine family, you could call them if you wanted to, but if we are counting down a list of brutal moments for the character, then there is one person in particular who needs to be talked about, and his name is Sabretooth. Victor Creed seems to be bad simply because he enjoys it. As a kid, he took the life of his older brother Luther over a piece of pie, and was absolutely ruthless to his younger brother Saul, who he would make a habit of putting a beat down on, particularly on Saul's birthday. When his mutant powers manifested, it only made bringing harm to others even easier for him, and he eventually took out his own father before going on a rampage through 3 Canadian provinces at just 13 years old. He would become a bit of a wanderer throughout his life, moving from different careers that allowed him to take advantage of his power in order to spill more blood. Now he eventually turned his savagery towards Wolverine, who happened to have taken the life of Saul, Sabretooth's younger brother. Sabretooth, in a really sick way, replaced Saul with Wolverine, making it his goal to make Wolverine's life a living hell. On every one of Wolverine's birthdays, he would beat Wolverine to within an inch of his life, and anyone Wolverine welcomed into his life, like those he would fall in love with, also became Victor's newest victims. And speaking of that, Sabretooth doesn't only try to ruin Wolverine's life on his birthdays. Anyone in Wolverine's life can become a target for Sabretooth, and Daken was Wolverine's son, born from Logan's marriage to a woman named Itsu, and the boy inherited his father's mutant abilities, but none of his morality. So in an attempt to gain revenge on his father, Daken teamed up with Sabretooth and the group known as the Red Right Hand, and the group's battle with X-Force culminated in Logan having to take the life of his own son. But with the powers of Wolverine, this is obviously no easy feat. Most people believe Wolverine is practically unkillable, but this is actually not entirely true. He does have 1 or 2 foolproof ways to bring him down, and one of them is water. With Daken leaving his pops no choice, Wolverine is kind of forced to hold his son face down in a puddle until he stops breathing. This moment is intercut with these flash imaginations that Wolverine is having of the life that they could have possibly shared together if things were a bit more normal. Now just as Daken takes his final breath and Logan mournfully is holding his son, Sabretooth appears on the scene, revealing that this has been his intention since he first partnered with Daken. Needless to say, we kinda hate Sabretooth here.